case of murder to be prosecuted in the courts, there must be two conditions fulfilled. Firstly, a murder has to have been committed. And secondly, there needs to be a body of evidence against a person said to have committed the act. When Edith Marion Rosse died in her West London home in 1932, the family, the police, and many others had no doubts that she had been murdered, and there was significant evidence pointing to the man responsible for this. But there was a difficulty. The evidence of her cause of death proved to be elusive, and without a proof of murder, the most compelling of cases against the man could not proceed to trial. It has been said, for this reason, that the death of Edith Marion Rosse at Hyde Park Terrace in 1932 was the perfect murder.
On the 19th of August 1932, Mrs. Edith Marion Rosse became very ill just after lunch in her home at Hyde Park Terrace in West London. She had been quite well before lunch, but within minutes of her meal she became very sick with vomiting and diarrhea. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Lottie Ayres, sent for a doctor, and also, at Mrs. Rosse's request, for her friend Arthur Maundy Gregory, with whom she shared the house, but who was presently at his office in Whitehall. "I feel so ill, I don't know if he will arrive in time," she said. In fact, Mr. Gregory arrived at Hyde Park Terrace at the same time as the doctor, a little after 3 p.m., and the two hastened to Edith Rosse's bedside. Dr. Plummer examined Mrs. Rosse, who was 59 years old, and he concluded that as the 19th of August was a very hot day, she was suffering from heat stroke. He prescribed complete bed rest, aspirin, and ice. It seems that although very sick, or perhaps because of this, Mrs. Rosse wished to make a will. Indeed, so urgent was the matter that Arthur Maundy Gregory, her friend, fetched a discarded Mayfair restaurant card and pencil, and Mrs. Rosse dictated her last will and testament to him, which he duly transcribed on the back of this menu. This was signed by Mrs. Rosse with some effort, and witnessed by Dr. Plummer and Mrs. Ayres. But it seems Mrs. Rosse's belief as to her dire condition was wrong, because in the next few days she recovered. The following week she went out driving, and by early September her health and spirits had returned to their former condition. But on Saturday evening, the 3rd of September, Mrs. Rosse, who dined in the evening with her friend Arthur Maundy Gregory in the upper-floor apartment at Hyde Park Terrace, was once again struck down by the same terrible illness. It was just after midnight when Dr. Plummer was sent for. This time he thought some form of blood poisoning was responsible for her illness, possibly a dysfunction of her kidneys. Mrs. Rosse regained consciousness only fitfully in the ensuing days, was confused. She was seen by two specialists who gave various opinions on the cause of her illness, and at 12:45, in the early hours of the 14th of September, she died. Dr. Plummer gave her cause of death as being cerebral hemorrhage and chronic Bright's disease, a generic term for kidney disease. Arthur Maundy Gregory, her friend in the apartment above hers, made the arrangements for her funeral at a small graveyard at Bisham, near Marlow, on the banks of the River Thames, and it was here that Edith Marion Rosse was laid to rest on the 19th of September 1932. The familiar adjunct Requiescat in Pace was carved onto the foot of her marble-crossed tombstone. May she rest in peace. And for a little time she did. Edith Marion Rosse was born Edith Davis in Edmonton, North London, in 1873. She was an attractive woman, and possessing a good singing voice, she went on stage and made a good living as an actress in musical comedies. She appeared in Dorothy, the Duchess of Danzig, and also in Gilbert and Sullivan operettas under the stage name Vivian Pierpont. In the early 1900s she met the composer Frederick Rosse, and they married in 1908, informally adopting her brother's daughter, Ethel Davis, after he was widowed around 1911. Husband and wife became very friendly with an actor come impresario called Arthur Maundy Gregory, and the three lived together at a wooden bungalow called Vanity Fair at Ditton Island on the Thames. Then at number 3 Abbey Road in St. John's Wood, the house which, 40 years later, was purchased by the Beatles as a recording studio, and outside of which John, Paul, George and Ringo famously walked across the zebra crossing in the summer of 1969. In 1923, Edith and Frederick Rosse separated, Edith and her niece Ethel remaining with Maundy Gregory at Abbey Road. Arthur Gregory and Edith were close in a platonic sense. He was probably a latent homosexual, and they told people they were brother and sister for the sake of appearances. Edith spent much of the money she received from her estranged husband on property. She owned 4 houses and 7 flats by the time of her death in 1932. She also had substantial savings. Her niece Ethel was periodically with them, but the two women had a stormy relationship. Edith was demanding, and Ethel had a rebellious disposition. Edith had made a will out favouring Ethel, but following a row over a ring she had given to Ethel, and Ethel had pawned, she tore the will up, saying, "Now you've burnt your boats." But privately she relented, and made another will favouring Ethel, and she nevertheless supported her with a weekly allowance. Sometime in the 3rd week of September, Ethel Davis visited her aunt at Hyde Park Terrace. She was shocked to learn from the housekeeper that Mrs. Rosse was dead and had been buried. It had all been arranged by her aunt's friend Arthur Gregory, without the family's knowledge. Ethel Davis telephoned Arthur Maundy Gregory. He was somewhat uncommunicative, and he told her he was unable to discuss her aunt's illness with her, as it was a matter of professional secrecy. Inquiries of Dr. Plummer concerning these matters drew a similarly short, unhelpful response. He too cited professional secrecy. Ethel's father, Fred Davis, visited Maundy Gregory's office at 38 Parliament Street, but his secretary, Mr. Pratley, said he was too ill to see anyone. He rang Dr. Plummer's surgery and requested an appointment to see the doctor, but the following day he received a letter from Dr. Plummer curtly refusing this, again citing professional secrecy. Fred Davis then went to the coroner's court in Paddington, but was simply advised he should contact a solicitor. He decided to write to Maundy Gregory, inquiring about his sister's grave, and also about her will, which he said his sister had led him to believe he would benefit from. He received a reply from Maundy Gregory's secretary. "Dear Sir, Mr. Gregory has asked me to thank you for your letter. He would like a little later to consider personally making you some little gift from himself as a memento. Believe me, yours faithfully, G. Pratley." It was all very frustrating, but he didn't give up. Fred Davis visited Somerset House, the Public Records Office, and asked to see Edith Rosse's will. Here he discovered that on the reverse side of a menu card, written in pencil and in a hand not familiar to him, was a will. It read, "Everything I have, if anything happens to me, to be left to Mr. J. Maundy Gregory, to be disposed of as he thinks best, and in accordance with what I desire." It was a shock. Fred Davis thought the will must be a forgery. He wrote to Edith Rosse's estranged husband, Frederick Rosse, who lived in Torquay, telling him of his suspicions. Rosse passed the matter to his solicitors for advice. He was himself somewhat concerned, because as part of their separation agreement, he had paid Edith half of his yearly earnings for the past 10 years, a sum not less than £4,000 all told. That's at least £250,000 in 2020 terms. He also realized, as he pointed out to Fred Davis, that as he was still technically married to Edith at the time of her death, he was legally her next of kin. By the new year, 1933, Ethel Davis was living on charity at a convent, and Fred Davis was broke. Then, on the 7th of February, Ethel Davis saw a newspaper headline which astonished her. Arthur Maundy Gregory had been charged with trying to sell a knighthood to a wealthy man for £10,000. The newspapers were filled with the story, and Ethel Davis knew she now had a bigger story to tell, because she believed that Maundy Gregory was more than a conman. He was a murderer. Emboldened by this knowledge, she went straight to Scotland Yard and spoke to Detective Inspector Arthur Askew, who was in charge of the investigation. She soon convinced him she had a lot to tell about Maundy Gregory, and indeed she did. It took Detective Sergeant Percy Ruffett and Detective Constable Hodge 3 days to take down Ethel's statement, which ran to 60 pages. Detective Inspector Askew pondered the matter. On the face of it, a 59-year-old wealthy woman had died. She was in the care of a doctor, and he had signed a death certificate, giving her cause of death as a natural one. But Arthur Maundy Gregory, the man who had been present when she died, and who was the sole beneficiary of her will, was not only a man who had been charged with attempting to sell a title. He was someone suspected of a bewildering number of crimes, including fraud, receiving stolen goods, and blackmail. He was also a man with friends in high places, and Arthur Maundy Gregory had proved hitherto astonishingly adept at avoiding prosecution. Arthur Maundy Gregory was born at Southampton in 1877, the son of the vicar of St. Michael's Church. He attended Bannister Court School there, and for a time attended Oxford University, studying divinity, intending to take holy orders. At school he had discovered an affinity for the theatre, and befriended another boy there, Harold Davidson, who was to become a lifelong acquaintance, and who was himself to become well known as the infamous rector of Stiffkey. It is worth mentioning this because there are extraordinary parallels in the two friends' careers and fortunes, and it seems rather curious that two such bad apples should be contemporaries and friends, alumni of the same school. Harold Davidson's fall from grace as rector of Stiffkey was to be every bit as spectacular as that of his friend Maundy Gregory's, when his vocation for saving the souls of London prostitutes was discovered to involve a great deal more than saving their souls. He was unfrocked, which was ironic, because a photograph of him emerged with a lady who was herself unfrocked. Having initially started out as an actor, Maundy Gregory established a touring company, and in 1908, with the assistance of his friend Harold Davidson, he mounted a West End production of Dorothy. It was here he met Edith Rosse. The two became platonic friends. The Rosses shared Maundy Gregory's homes and vice versa, until Frederick and Edith separated. But Maundy Gregory was not successful as an impresario. His talents lay in his bonhomie, his avuncular air of geniality. It provided him with the perfect role, one which he was to play for the rest of his life. He was acquainted with a large number of people in the theatrical world and beyond, and in 1914 he set himself up as a private detective of sorts. He had a talent for weaseling out the private sexual habits and indiscretions of people, and he soon found he could use the information he obtained to blackmail them. He began to supply information to MI5 too. He was probably responsible for the acquisition of Sir Roger Casement's so-called Black Diaries, whose wide dissemination revealing explicit homosexual activities led to a collapse in public sympathy for Casement after he had been sentenced to death for treason in 1916. Calls for a reprieve for Casement were loud. He had done notable work in his earlier years for humanitarian causes. The U.S. Senate was vocal in seeking Casement's reprieve, and in 1916 Britain was assiduously courting the U.S. in the hopes of persuading her to enter World War I. The sharing of Casement's diaries with the U.S. ambassador to St. James led to a swift collapse in such support for Casement, and he was executed. But the Secret Service did not trust Maundy Gregory. A report, written in March of 1926, began, "We know him, and we don't trust him." He became editor of a society magazine called Mayfair, and of the Whitehall Gazette too. But it was in 1918 that he became involved in the scandal for which he is best remembered. Prime Minister Lloyd George needed to raise funds for the Liberal Party to fight the forthcoming general election, and he decided to do so by selling titles for cash. Maundy Gregory was just the man for this. He used his knowledge of those on the fringe of society, his knowledge of their lives and aspirations, and most of all their vanity, to sell honours to them. The going rate for a knighthood was about £10,000. That's about £750,000 in today's terms, and for a peerage £40,000, approximately £2.5 million today. Maundy Gregory approached people with this tariff, and as a result, a great many peerages and knighthoods were dispensed after 1918. The coffers of the Liberal Party filled with lucre, and so did Maundy Gregory's pockets. He became a very wealthy man. It should also be said that he was a generous man too. He gave money to those he knew freely. He funded an author to write a book on the eccentric Baron Corvo, whom he admired. He funded gilding work to be carried out at Westminster Abbey for £5,000, and he was careful to ensure everyone knew of this. He acquired the Ambassadors' Club in Conduit Street, which he used as a front for much of his business, and the 90-bedroom Deepdene Hotel in Surrey, with the aid of a rascally second-generation Italian called Peter Mazzina, whom he employed. Most of his shady enterprises were loss-makers, but the titles brokerage was very lucrative. But by 1922, the matter of titles sales was becoming a national scandal. 4 notorious businessmen, war profiteers, were ennobled, and took their seats in the House of Lords, angering King George V even. It was widely known that they had purchased their titles. Amidst a public outcry, Parliament resolved to act. The practice was curtailed by the Honours Commission of 1922, and in 1925 the Honours Prevention of Abuses Act explicitly forbade the sale of honours, and made it a criminal offence for anyone to seek to sell an honour or title of the United Kingdom, or to pay for one. It was a blow to Maundy Gregory, but Maundy Gregory was nothing if not adaptable. He continued to offer honours for sale by stealth to those unaware that he had no titles to dispense. When he sold titles to people which failed to materialize, they were left in the invidious position of not being able to report Maundy Gregory to the police, since they would themselves be liable to prosecution for having attempted to purchase one in the first place. Maundy Gregory was now a fully fledged conman. His approach was comical, incredible even. He would have a likely dupe ushered into his plush office at 38 Parliament Square, a whisper away from 10 Downing Street, where he sat behind a large desk equipped with a phalanx of telephones and signed photographs of various royal persons. He would greet his intended mark with an outstretched, heavily ringed hand. They would notice his diamond-encrusted cufflinks, a black pearl tie-pin, and he would offer them a cigarette from a gold cigarette case, which he would contrive to mention was a gift from the King of Greece. Perhaps they would care to meet him. The phone would ring, and he would have a nondescript conversation, which would involve him saying at some point, "Certainly, Your Majesty," or "Of course, Your Royal Highness." He would inevitably be interrupted by a private secretary to inform him in hushed tones that number 10 was on the phone. He would excuse himself apologetically while turning over in his fingers a large rose diamond he kept in his waistcoat pocket, which had once belonged, apparently, to the Tsar of Russia. He was also known to drive to Buckingham Palace with a potential dupe, stop off, excusing himself, and appear to enter the palace by a side entrance. After a while he would reappear, apologizing to his would-be victim, and inform them how important it was for him not to be seen to enter by the front gate. His Majesty would not like it, he would tell them solemnly. In this, at least, he was probably correct. But Maundy Gregory's fortunes were in terminal decline. The new laws and other measures had a serious impact on his activities, and when a wealthy man died having paid him for a title and not received it, his family sued, and Maundy Gregory was forced to repay the money, £30,000, about £2.5 million today. He didn't have this, and he took yet greater risks in an attempt to recoup his losses, like a gambler doubling down. He diversified too. He converted to Roman Catholicism and proceeded to offer papal knighthoods for sale. He awarded one to himself, becoming Sir Arthur Maundy Gregory. The Roman Catholic father of Mia Farrow paid for an annulment to his marriage so that he could marry the actress Maureen O'Sullivan. He didn't get it. Gregory next set up the Anglo-Ukrainian Committee, ostensibly to fight Bolshevism, but which he used to sell Ukrainian titles and pocketed the money himself. But his debts were mounting, his sources of revenue were shrinking. Taking ever-increasing risks, in December of 1932 he attempted to sell a baronetcy to Lieutenant Commander Billiard Leake. It was a mistake. Billiard Leake was a wealthy landed man. Old money, not a new industrialist jockeying for acceptance on the fringes of society. Billiard Leake went to the authorities. It was this that led to Maundy Gregory's being charged for offences against the Honours Act. Inspector Askew knew that Maundy Gregory was thoroughly dishonest, a man without scruple, a con man, an accomplished liar. But was he also a murderer? By the summer of 1932, Maundy Gregory had been in severe financial difficulties. It was at this point he had turned to his friend, Edith Marion Rosse, for a loan. She had refused him, and it was just a few weeks after her refusal of a loan that Mrs. Rosse had become violently ill and died. Askew took statements from the doctors, the undertaker, and from the dead woman's brother and her niece. Inquiries with medical men produced the unequivocal opinion that the symptoms described by those who had been with Mrs. Rosse during her illness were those of acute poisoning, and nothing that could possibly be attributed to cerebral hemorrhage or Bright's disease. But the opinion of an entire medical community, based on reported symptoms alone, was of little value against the stubborn fact of the death certificate issued by the doctor who treated her. Askew interviewed Mr. Benjamin Pengelly, Maundy Gregory's and Mrs. Ross's accountant, who told him that a second will had been made by Mrs. Rosse after she had torn up the original one. Ethel was still the chief beneficiary in this, and still nothing had been left to Maundy Gregory. He also told him that Mrs. Ross's cash books and a diary of accounts book, which he had requested from Maundy Gregory, had been duly sent to him, with sections having been removed. 29 pages in all were missing. Pengelly also said Mrs. Rosse had told him that Maundy Gregory was very bad-tempered recently, and said she thought he was financially worried. She expressed her surprise at this, because she had thought him to be very wealthy. She also inquired, he said, whether Mr. Pengelly had told Maundy Gregory of her financial deposits, which appeared to show a concern on her part for Maundy Gregory's interest in her finances. In addition, Frederick Rosse, the estranged husband, emphatically denied his wife would have made such a will, and certainly not whilst in her right mind. Inspector Askew had amassed a large amount of indicative evidence, but he knew that really this did little more than suggest that Maundy Gregory had the motive to commit the act of murder. Nothing existed in the way of actual proof that a murder had been committed. The prosecution in respect of the sale of honours was difficult enough and fraught with political sensitivities. An ill-supported charge of murder risked upsetting this finely balanced matter. The investigation was slow. There were discussions at Scotland Yard concerning the evidence, which it was believed was strong enough for a conviction. But still there was the lack of proof that a murder had occurred. The case needed something to push it so that the next step could be taken. On the 6th of April, it got it. The solicitors acting for Mr. Rosse requested an exhumation of the body of Edith Marion Rosse. They wanted a second opinion on the cause of her death. 6 days later, on advice from Scotland Yard, this was granted. Meanwhile, Maundy Gregory, who appeared before magistrates for attempting to sell a baronetcy on the advice of his counsel Norman Burkett, K.C., pleaded guilty. He may also have obtained the promise that if he pleaded guilty, and thus spared much embarrassment to many people in public life, and helped them avoid a terrific scandal, he would be taken care of afterwards. As a result of this, the matter did not go to trial, and he received a 2-month prison sentence and a £50 fine. As far as the police were concerned, Maundy Gregory was now safely in prison, while the matter of Mrs. Rosse's death was investigated. On the morning of the 28th of April 1933, Askew received the order authorizing exhumation of the body of Mrs. Rosse, and he moved quickly. By nightfall, he and Dr. Roche, the Home Office analyst, along with other detectives, stood at the graveside in Bisham Cemetery on the banks of the River Thames. A derrick was erected over the grave, and the marble cross headstone weighing half a ton was raised, and then the men began to shovel away the clogged heavy riverbank clay. It didn't take long, as the coffin was discovered to be buried a mere 18 inches beneath the surface. Canvas straps were placed under it, and the men lifted it to the surface. Water streamed from it as it tilted slightly. It was an ill omen, and Roche cursed, and attempted to catch some of the water draining from it in a beaker. The undertaker peered at its brass nameplate and confirmed that this was the coffin of Edith Rosse. It was then sealed with red bands, and the ends of the coffin sealed too, and then it was trundled some 20 yards to a van which awaited it. From here it was taken under police guard to Paddington Mortuary, arriving there that evening, where it remained overnight. In the morning at 10 a.m., the press, having learned that an inquest was to be opened, were out in force at the coroner's court in Paddington, which was situated in the same building as the mortuary. Inspector Askew was first to arrive with other detectives, then Roche carrying a large square box in which empty sample jars could be seen. And then the pathologist, Sir Bernard Spilsbury, arrived at a little after 10 a.m. With the coffin on the bench, Spilsbury cut the sealing tapes under the watchful eyes of Askew and Roche. The lid was lifted, and Spilsbury was dismayed. The coffin, which was lead-lined because the graveyard was on the Thames floodplain, had not been sealed. The usual practice was to seal the coffin by soldering the lid, but this had not been done, and consequently it was filled with water. It had lain underground for some months. The state of preservation of the corpse was not good. It was a great disappointment. After Frederick Rosse had confirmed the identity of his wife's body, the corpse was lifted from the coffin, and Spilsbury commenced his grim work with his customary matter-of-factness, punctuated only by his clipped observations. Various organs, including the stomach, liver, kidneys, brain, and heart, were removed and placed in glass jars by Roche. While the post-mortem was in progress, just a few yards away, Samuel Ingleby Oddie, the Paddington coroner, opened the inquest into the death of Edith Marion Rosse. Her husband, Frederick Rosse, confirmed the identity of the woman as seen in the coffin as being his wife, Edith. The formalities of identification completed, Ingleby Oddie adjourned the inquest to permit the pathologist, analyst, and police to complete their inquiries. It had all lasted for less than 10 minutes. Later that same day, in the early evening of the 29th of April, the coffin of Edith Marion Rosse was reinterred in its grave at Bisham Cemetery, while a fascinated crowd assembled on the opposite bank of the Thames to watch the procedure. In the weeks that followed, speculation was rife. The Daily Herald confidently asserted that poison had been found. It was widely known that this was a murder investigation. Maundy Gregory featured prominently in newspaper reports, and the focus on him was intense. He had not been seen. Where was he? It was understood that he had been released from prison. Inspector Askew was hoping to arrest Maundy Gregory and subject him to the pressures of interrogation. But he had disappointing news. Gregory had been released early from Wormwood Scrubs for good behaviour on the morning of the 12th of April. He had been collected at the prison gates by a friend of J.C.C. Davidson, the chairman of the Conservative Party. He was driven to New Haven, where he took the ferry for Dieppe. Within 12 hours of his release from prison, Arthur Maundy Gregory was in Paris. Detective Inspector Arthur Askew knew nothing of this development until it was too late. It was a serious setback to his inquiries. His only hope now was for the coroner to order the return of Maundy Gregory. The inquest was finally reconvened on the 19th of July. The coroner's court was packed. The family was present, and the detectives, the expert witnesses, an army of reporters, but there was, of course, no sign of the principal character, Maundy Gregory. The coroner opened the proceedings with an account of the events which had led to Mrs. Rosse's death and to her exhumation. This account clearly followed the official narrative. In August 1932, said the coroner, Maundy Gregory was in financial difficulties, owing £1,000, and creditors were in pursuit. He spoke of Mrs. Rosse's sudden illness after lunch on the 19th of August, and Dr. Plummer's improbable diagnosis of heat-stroke. He referred to the arrival of Maundy Gregory from Whitehall, and the hasty dictation of the will to him, in pencil and on the reverse of the menu card. He referred to Mrs. Rosse's recovery under her own doctor, and of her being taken seriously ill a second time on the night of the 3rd and 4th of September after dinner with Maundy Gregory, which led to her death on the 14th of September. He said that Maundy Gregory had thereafter obtained probate of the will and had set about its disbursement immediately. Mr. Gregory had arranged for her burial, and the inquiries of relatives had led to a police investigation and to the exhumation of her body. Frederick Rosse, her ex-husband, was again the first witness. He gave evidence of his separation from his wife in December 1923, and said he had not seen her since that time. He said he had heard of her death in a letter sent to him by Maundy Gregory. This read, "Dear Fred, poor Edith passed away peacefully early this morning at 10 to 1. She had a heat-stroke nearly a month ago, and a relapse last Saturday week. We did everything we could for her. 3 specialists and 2 nurses. She did not suffer at all towards the end. Yours, J.M.G." Lottie Ayres, Mrs. Ross's housekeeper, said she had believed that her mistress and Maundy Gregory were brother and sister. Mrs. Ross's lunch on the 19th of August had been of sandwiches and a half bottle of champagne. She had heard Mrs. Rosse call out, "Come quickly, Ayres, I am so ill." She collapsed on the bed, and Lottie Ayres and the other housekeeper, Mrs. Wells, put her to bed. Mrs. Kate Wells, who was Maundy Gregory's housekeeper in the upper floors, told the court Maundy Gregory had taken care of the drinks on the evening of the 3rd of September. Hilda May Howard, Mrs. Ross's former housekeeper, said that when she visited her on the 4th of September, she found her ill and nursed her. She said all Mrs. Ross's food was prepared by Mrs. Ayres. The coroner's line of questioning was indicative of his suspicions in the matter. "Was Mr. Maundy Gregory frequently in her room?" he asked her. "Very frequently," she replied. "Did he ever give her food?" "None at all." Dr. F. Kernow Plummer said he had never attended Mrs. Rosse until called on to do so on the 19th of August. The will was genuine, he said, and was dictated in his hearing. The coroner asked him, "Did you at any time suspect that anything had been administered to your patient in the way of poison?" "No," he replied. Mr. Benjamin George Pengelly, accountant, said Mrs. Rosse had left an estate of about £18,800, about £1.4 million today. He said that Mrs. Rosse had told him Maundy Gregory had pressed her for financial assistance before July 1932. She had refused him. She had made a will in 1923, naming Miss Ethel Davis, her niece, as the chief beneficiary of this, and Maundy Gregory did not benefit at all from it. He said that Gregory persuaded her to tear up the will and destroy it on account of the niece giving so much trouble. However, she had relented and made another, reinstating her niece as main beneficiary of her estate, and still leaving nothing to Maundy Gregory. He spoke of large chunks from her accounts books having been removed when he received them from Maundy Gregory. Walter William Mann, undertaker, said he had asked Maundy Gregory whether he wished for the coffin lid to be sealed, and he had declined. Sir Bernard Spilsbury told the court he could not ascertain the cause of death. He said there had been no hemorrhage of the brain, and there were no signs of Bright's disease. He agreed with the coroner that the death certificate was quite wrong. Dr. Roche Lynch said he had been unable to find any trace of poison or noxious substances in the samples he had taken. He said this may have been due to the waterlogged condition of the body, as it had been under water for some months due to the site of the grave being on the banks of the Thames. Dr. George M. Blair, Mrs. Ross's usual doctor, said he had been very surprised when he heard Mrs. Ross had died. There had been nothing in her health to suggest she had serious illness. Detective Inspector Askew said that he had subpoenaed Maundy Gregory to appear at the inquest, but that he had not done so, and that he was believed to be in Paris. The solicitor for the family of Mrs. Ross, Mr. Vine, probed Askew pointedly. "You have not had an opportunity of having an interview with him?" he asked. "That is so," replied Askew. "He would be a very important witness." "I take that view." He then followed this by requesting that Maundy Gregory appear before the court for questioning, but the coroner rejected this. He said that in view of the fact that no cause of death had been discovered, the only possible verdict the jury could give was an open one. He also said there could be no purpose in subjecting Maundy Gregory to cross-examination, because it would lead nowhere. "The result is a negative one," he said. "No poison has been found, and no poison will ever be found in the body. Therefore, no possible charge could arise out of this inquiry." He recorded, "There is not sufficient evidence to show the cause of Mrs. Ross's death, which is therefore unascertained." And there the matter ended. It was, of course, a great pity that the coroner rejected the opportunity of some searching questions being put to Maundy Gregory. He was the principal witness, against whom the whole court narrative was directed. Detective Inspector Askew had hoped that in spite of the negative result of Roche Lynch's poison tests, he could effect Maundy Gregory's return through a coroner's order, which might enable him to arrest him. It was most unsatisfactory. The coroner may have felt he had little choice in the matter, because the inability to establish a cause of death meant that it could only be an unexplained death. If death could not be proved to be due to wilful murder, then there could be no murderer. It was an unhappy end to the police inquiry, and entirely unsatisfactory for the relations of Mrs. Ross. The narrative pursued in court by the coroner left little doubt that he suspected Maundy Gregory of being the murderer. His entire mode of questioning was directed to this end, constantly probing at the motive and opportunity Maundy Gregory may have had, and of course he did this in the full knowledge and having known personally for some weeks that no poison had been found in the organs by Roche Lynch, and that Spilsbury had been unable to ascertain the cause of death. His intention here was therefore plain, to indicate that death was highly suspicious, that it remained so, and that only Maundy Gregory could be linked to that death by motive and opportunity. But he was also clear that, however great such suspicions might be, No further action was possible in law because no proof existed or could ever exist. The coroner, Ingleby Oddie, was a barrister as well as a doctor. He had in fact played a part in the prosecution of Dr. Crippen 20 years earlier. He knew the inquiry could lead nowhere. This may account for his pointing so deliberately at Maundy Gregory's actions in his conduct of the hearing and his suggestive line of questioning. It would still, however, have been acting within the scope of his authority for him to issue a summons for Maundy Gregory to appear to give full account of his actions in the matter. He was, after all, the critical witness around whom all actions concerning Mrs. Rosse's death seemed to pivot. It is unlikely that it would have resulted in a different verdict at inquest, but it would have permitted searching questions to be put to him. It would also, of course, have given Inspector Askew the opportunity of arresting Gregory and obtaining a detailed statement from him. Spilsbury himself was in no doubt in the matter. There was no sign of chronic illness which could account for Edith Rosse's death, and her symptoms were highly suggestive of poisoning. He believed that the burial had deliberately taken place on the Thames floodplain to ensure the dissipation of evidence. Roche Lynch, too, was dismayed that the body and coffin had proved to be so waterlogged, owing to the lead lid being left unsealed. Furthermore, he remarked in court that he had never seen a coffin buried so near to the surface. And of course the police were quite certain that Maundy Gregory had murdered Mrs. Rosse, and that he had done so to acquire her money. Years later, Detective Inspector Askew said, "I'm convinced Gregory murdered Mrs. Rosse. Furthermore, if he had not skipped out of the country on his release from Wormwood Scrubs, I would have rearrested him on a murder charge." What subterfuges Maundy Gregory employed to persuade Mrs. Rosse to disinherit her niece in favour of himself we cannot know. But he was a man schooled in the art of persuading people to hand over money for a fistful of beans. It is probable that the will she made was written with a wording devised by Maundy Gregory. It's not at all believable that the words appearing on the will were those she spoke. In her confused state, it is likely he asked her a series of carefully phrased leading questions, such as, "Would you like me to take care of things in accordance with your wishes, dear?" She would naturally assent to this, and an inattentive doctor and housekeeper would believe that they had heard her dictate her will. The use of pencil in the transcription was also peculiar. Both Maundy Gregory and the doctor signed their names in pen. It was the suspicion of the police that it had been transcribed in pencil to enable it to be revised subsequently if necessary. But of course none of this was enough to charge, still less to convict Maundy Gregory. The most persuasive circumstances were nothing if it could not be proved that there had been a murder in the first place. The public prosecutor does not waste time pursuing cases which cannot be won or which do not have a good prospect of being successful. It has been suggested that Maundy Gregory used the fortuitous circumstances of Mrs. Rosse's natural death to his own advantage, but it is improbable. Too many circumstances tell against this. The timing of her death, the suddenness of her illness, the onset of her final illness after dinner with Maundy Gregory on the 3rd of September, the will made in his favour only 3 weeks before this, made by him, dictated to him, leaving all to him, the circumstances of his financial difficulties, and her refusal of a loan to him, the choice of burial site, and the shallowness of the grave and the unsealed coffin, all offer an overwhelming suspicion that he did indeed kill Edith Rosse. But this is, of course, not the same thing as a legal proof. Had poison been found in Mrs. Rosse's organs, then the evidence obtained would have been more than enough to hang Maundy Gregory. But it was not found, and as a consequence of this there was no proof of a murder on which to proceed. But as a matter not of satisfying the high standard of legal proof, but that of historical judgment, whose requirements are not restrained by considerations affecting the life and liberty of an individual, it may reasonably be judged that in September 1932 Arthur Maundy Gregory probably got away with the murder of Edith Marion Rosse. She was said to be Maundy Gregory's friend, but Maundy Gregory had no friends. He was a strange, sociable yet solitary man, somewhat insulated against the world. He had many acquaintances. But if the 1920s had begun with Maundy Gregory at the height of his powers and wealth, they closed with him out of favour and broke. He had creditors snapping at his heels. He had debts and no means of clearing them. The net was closing on him. Deep Dean Hotel was closed, the Ambassadors' Club too. He could no longer pay the rent on his Whitehall office. His empire was shrinking. His urgent request to Edith Rosse was denied. He resented her refusal to lend him money. She paid him a peppercorn rent of £1 each week, and he had paid for holidays for her in Monte Carlo. He was undoubtedly a generous man. It was the first time he had asked her for anything, and she refused him. He believed he had done much for her, and he lived by the principle of quid pro quo. For every action he undertook, he expected an equal and opposite reaction in his favour. He knew no other kind of transaction. And Edith Rosse was a 59-year-old woman whose value to him was diminishing, both as a friend and as a future resource. But of course she had property, she had wealth, she probably knew things about Maundy Gregory too, and Maundy Gregory weighed such factors, and in doing so he found that Edith Rosse was worth a great deal more to him dead than living. The idea of the loan he had sought from her was replaced by a new plan. His creditors had become more insistent and more threatening, his needs more urgent. Her trust in him as a friend remained intact, of course. He knew that a conman must never lose that. His smile, his kindly, avuncular demeanour was undiminished, did not disclose what lay within. His manner never betrayed him. Edith Rosse didn't see the glint in his eye that had her measure, that sought the means and moment of converting his acquaintance with her into cash to offset his financial difficulties. Maundy Gregory knew how to acquire the trust of someone, and the right moment to turn that trust into a subtle threat. It was what he did best. He persuaded her, provoked her even, into destroying the earlier will in favour of her niece, at a propitious moment of anger at one of the niece's many transgressions. Of course, the destruction of the will left a vacuum, a problem for the woman who had now disinherited her only relative of the succeeding generation. This would inevitably play on her mind, especially in times of sickness and doubt. Perhaps she and her niece would be reconciled. They always were. She had taken care of her niece since she was a child. Such bonds, even when anger strikes at them, are hard to break. She made another will, but did not tell Maundy Gregory. Oblivious to this, he continued to supply her with ideas, to suggest with great subtlety how she might proceed, to imbue her with trust in him and faith in his good will to carry out her wishes. And when the moment came, in crisis, and through the fog of illness enveloping her, Edith Rosse was prepared to place all in the hands of her oldest friend. And though she didn't know it, as she was signing the will in his favour, she was signing her own death warrant. Arthur Maundy Gregory surely escaped the hangman's noose. But it may not have been for the first time, because 12 years earlier there was another occasion whose outcome remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century in Britain. And at the heart of this mystery is Arthur Maundy Gregory. In 1920, Maundy Gregory was making a fortune from his highly successful honours-broking business. But the more successful such a scheme, the more widely it becomes known, and people were becoming aware of it. In 1920, this situation came to the attention of a man called Victor Grayson. He was an ex-MP and maverick firebrand socialist who had come to public attention by winning a sensational by-election in Colne Valley in 1907. Grayson and Gregory became friends, possibly even lovers, and when Victor Grayson discovered that Maundy Gregory was relaying information on him to MI5, he felt betrayed. Maundy Gregory now had a mortal enemy. Grayson knew of Maundy Gregory's role in the honours business, and he also discovered that Maundy Gregory had been responsible for the discovery of Sir Roger Casement's Black Diaries, which had destroyed Casement's public reputation. He believed, erroneously as it happened, that Gregory had forged the Casement diaries himself. He was determined to expose him. In a public speech in Liverpool, Grayson spoke of the matter. "The sale of honours is a national scandal," he said. "It can be traced right down to 10 Downing Street, and to a monocled dandy with offices in Whitehall. I know this man, and one day I will name him." It was clear to Maundy Gregory and to others that the monocled dandy referred to was himself. Maundy Gregory knew he was in danger. He was a man who operated by having something on everyone. Knowledge was the lever he believed could move the world. But now someone had something on him, something that would bring his intricate empire of cards crashing down, and with it all his connections and influence and wealth. Victor Grayson had something on him which would mean his ruin. Grayson lived rather well in 1920 for someone without an income. He was almost certainly blackmailing Maundy Gregory, which explains why he only referred to a monocled dandy, but didn't name him directly. There was no reason for not doing so. It was not a slander. But the release of the name would remove the power of blackmail. Blackmail exists as a threat of exposing someone, not of actually doing so, because that deprives it of its force. But blackmail is only ever a temporary solution. It must be resolved by another means, sooner or later. It was. Victor Grayson vanished. Accounts of his disappearance vary greatly. One account tells of Grayson drinking with some friends when he received a telephone message, after which he left, assuring his friends he would return in a few minutes' time, but didn't. It has been claimed that Grayson was seen entering Maundy Gregory's house that evening at Thames Ditton, where he lived at the time, coincidentally with Edith Marion Rosse and her husband Frederick. But the evidence for this is unsatisfactory. It has also been claimed, more recently, that Grayson was paid off and lived in France under an assumed name until the 1950s. There were, of course, numerous sightings of him, but the Grayson family dismissed these. Whatever the details, on or around the 28th of September 1920, Victor Grayson disappeared. Grayson's family searched for him and made public appeals in 1927, 1934, and 1942, without success. An MI5 inquiry into the matter failed to elicit any result either. He was never seen again. For official purposes, his death has been accepted to have occurred on the 28th of September 1920. And in spite of the enduring appeal of alternative narratives, this is the overwhelming probability. The chief suspect in this, based on his known association with Grayson, the probability of his having been blackmailed by Grayson, and the fact that the mentally unstable Grayson had become the greatest threat to him, was Maundy Gregory. The weight of this motive and other circumstantial features, which are nevertheless substantial, have long made Maundy Gregory the prime suspect in Grayson's disappearance. It can never be proved, of course. Grayson had other enemies, but the greatest of these, and the one to whom he posed an urgent threat, was Maundy Gregory. It is by no means a certainty, but it is sufficient in my view to satisfy the balance of probabilities in historical terms to conclude that Arthur Maundy Gregory was responsible for these two murders. After leaving Britain in great haste that April night in 1933, certainly with the assistance of others who had an interest in this matter, but without the knowledge of the secret services or the police, Maundy Gregory lived at number 8, Rue d'Anjou, which had been the Paris home of the Marquis de Lafayette in 1834. He must have felt a little like Napoleon on Elba, remote from the world he knew, hopeful of a return one day, a renewal of his fortunes. There was an understanding that he would only be arrested if he returned to Britain. He received money from Britain from various sources, many of them illicit. It was said he received a pension of £2,000 per year, paid to him each quarter by the liquor lobby in Westminster. But like most things said about Maundy Gregory, it is hard to pin down the extent to which this is true. He lived well, his apartment was grand, but he was not proficient in French, and he liked to buy English newspapers. He will have read here of the fate of his old school friend Harold Davidson, the disgraced ex-rector of Stiffkey, who, whilst appearing in a sideshow in Blackpool in 1937, entered a lion's cage, like Daniel, but unlike Daniel, was seized by a lion and shaken like a rag doll, before dying of his injuries. Maundy Gregory no longer sought the limelight. He was somewhat isolated in these years. He had a small dog called Monsieur Le Beau, and he spent most of his days drinking whisky. Maundy Gregory had in him both the seeds of his success and of his destruction. Those qualities which had brought him success made his ruin a certainty. He was a hugely vain man, and that was a deep failing. But his vanity was also his strength, because he recognized it in others, and he knew how to assuage it, to work it to his own advantage. It was vanity that caused the wealthy northern cotton manufacturer or industrialist to pay him £10,000 for a knighthood, or £40,000 for a peerage, and by so doing attempt to raise themselves above their fellow men. A vanity which overturned their sense, their judgment, and natural prudence. It was a confidence trick on the grandest of scales, since nothing material was given in exchange for the large sums of money paid. Because a title has no substance, he sold them thin air, fine clothes for the foolish emperor to adorn and flatter him. We are all susceptible to flattery and vanity, and no one knew this better than Maundy Gregory. It made him a fortune, and it lost it for him too. Maundy Gregory remains today the only person ever convicted of selling titles under the 1925 Act. If there is a lesson to be learned from Maundy Gregory's life, it is that the gods care nothing for those who seek to elevate themselves above their fellows, and make fools of those who try. Maundy Gregory was a busted flush in 1933. MI6 was still concerned Maundy Gregory might assist the Nazis, and as late as March 1940 asked the French authorities to keep an eye on him. But the war had no place for monocled mountebanks. Maundy Gregory was still in Paris in May 1940 when the German assault on Western Europe began. He was 63 years old now. The German blitzkrieg swept all before it. France had fallen within 6 weeks, and Maundy Gregory was detained in October 1940 by the German authorities and interned at Drancy camp. He was ill, spent most of his time in the camp infirmary, and was then transferred to Val de Gras Hospital on the left bank of the Seine, where he died of heart failure on the 28th of September 1941. Which was, curiously enough, the same day Victor Grayson, is said to have disappeared 2 decades earlier. Death is a great leveller. Maundy Gregory was buried anonymously, and years later his bones were disinterred, finding their way to one of Paris's great ossuaries, along with those of thousands of others. Here there is nothing to tell the bones of prince or pauper apart. At the entrance to the great Paris ossuary, the catacombs, which houses the skeletons of some 7 million people, where the lives and loves and laughter, hopes and fears and vanities of all are stilled, the words, "Stop, this is the empire of the dead," is inscribed. Perhaps Arthur Maundy Gregory, in common with those who sought titles from him, and to whom he sold the invisible fine raiments that he himself wore, had found his empire at last.